So I think the first thing that, we wanted to ask you guys is that, you both come from such diverse backgrounds. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey up until this point in your journey into startups? So maybe Tom, maybe you could start us off there.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, hey Tim, hello everyone. Yeah, so I'm a doctor by training. I spent 4 years working full-time in hospitals and 2 years as a surgical trainee. So going down general and vascular surgical routes. Prior to med, I did a lot of basically pure maths and technology. So I kind of had that basic interest from pretty early on. And I was tossing up between like a consulting, pure maths kind of lifestyle, but thought it was a little soulless, and the people that were going into medicine I kind of liked. So that was enough for me to go in that direction. And I had an experience founding a business during med school, helping people get into medicine, going from tutoring sort of like 10 people over a laundromat to 2,000 plus every year in all states across Australia. And yeah, just found that organic problem solving was really present in business in a way that a lot of industry and professional jobs, even something as interesting as surgery, is very algorithmic and checklist oriented. And in business, every day there's a problem that has some shape or form that you've never seen before that you have to solve. So that was the impetus for me to take that kind of leap of faith towards the end of last year, going from full-time in the operating theaters to full-time for Oscer. And yeah, had the guys at Blackbird to thank for backing us, and Oscer, but also the clinical product that is derived from Oscer that is hopefully launching this year.
Yeah, awesome. Just to expand on that a little bit, you've gone through this really arduous pathway of medicine and then made that jump, like you said. Was there any hesitation or kind of sunk cost fallacy there? And how did you grapple with that decision?
Yeah, for sure. I think my parents and family members still grappling with it today. I still have to come through the goods and succeed. But yeah, I mean, I don't know, you only live life once. It seems like a bit of a cheesy thing to say, but I just felt myself enjoying working at Oscer and trying to find every waking moment at the hospital or not at the hospital to work on Oscer. And for me, that was enough of a signal to just kind of go for it. The good thing about medicine is that it is like the ultimate safety net. So, I'll still have my registration. Worst case scenario, I can fall back on being a doctor, which isn't the worst thing in the world. But sometimes you just gotta back yourself, I guess, and just go for it.
Yeah, awesome. And Tim, can you tell us a little bit about your journey up until Eucalyptus?
Yeah, I feel hilariously underqualified compared to Tom after that description of his deep medical background. So I was selling mattresses on the internet, and then realized that a point of friction in I think for those that don't know Koala, the thing that it does really well is it simplifies a complicated offline buying decision and makes it simple in an online environment. And then it verticalizes around that and creates margin by combining what are usually disparate offline services and turning them into a single close to seamless online experience. And I think if you look at general practice, it's a horizontal layer that protects a very expensive specialist system, and therefore the patient's experience kind of it suffers because they have to go through multiple layers to get to the care they need in a lot of cases, and that's for cost reasons. And so the internet allows us to subspecialize in a way that is interesting and allows patients to access kind of vertical care in a way that is valuable to them. And I think that was an insight that came from Koala and allowed us to launch Eucalyptus. And then since then, I think COVID allowed us to compound that experience and build out what I think is a pretty compelling front door to the healthcare system across a couple of conditions, and hopefully many more over the next few years.
Yeah, awesome. I think that's a good segue to the next questions that we had. So just curious, what were the early days like? How did you guys go about forming the ideas for Eucalyptus and Oscer? How did you guys go about going from idea to product? And how did you acquire your first customers? So a bit of a loaded question, but yeah, what were the early days like? And maybe Tim, you could start us off.
Yeah, sure. I actually think interestingly, Tom and I probably have, not to put words in his mouth, but Tom and I probably have a similar original insight around like the GP decision-making lens and how to start to like make that more valuable and more automated. I think like he used the phrasing of like a decision tree, or like something like a checklist, I think was the words actually. And I think like we saw the same checklist. And we said like, where is margin in this checklist? And I think because Tom's from a medical background and I'm not, he probably saw it in like the, hey, we can provide services to doctors, when I was like, actually, some of these doctors are maybe a little bit redundant in some of this process. And so in terms of like framing that in the early days, we were like, well, where is simple conditions where we can solve through simple technology? And I think like erectile dysfunction and hair loss are low stakes conditions. So the main problem to solve there is discretion and convenience. And so we targeted them first, built discrete and convenient solutions that allowed patients to input data that doctors could then quickly pass and then make a decision on. And then once they'd made that decision, pass that script to a pharmacy, and we could capture some margin throughout that journey. And then acquiring the first customers, I think like we went to market in a really simple direct to consumer way, allowed us to kind of test some messaging, see what works. You know, our first product was really shit. I think like people were answering phone calls. Alexi, who's for some reason is on this call, my co-founder, is, you know, he was on the phones early on, answering patient calls, and then eventually we were piping that into a prescription engine, and then like automate, scale from there. And, you know, we now do, you know, thousands of customers a day. So it's been a pretty rapid scale from that point.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, completely agree. Like very similar kind of insight. And yeah, I also think a lot of what doctors do is redundant and can be streamlined. So I guess from an Oscer perspective, like on the education side, the first problem that I had was actually out in the country. So I was, you know, being a doctor and seeing patients, and it was like Russian roulette. Some of the patients I would see had been triaged as completely fine in the waiting room, and they were not fine at all and grey and nearly dead. And then there were patients who had been triaged as super urgent who were actually really well. And so the idea of like a medical knowledge graph, or a way to do a doctor's reasoning in a consistent, replicable, automated way, actually came from that experience. Like I just didn't understand why I was going to see a patient and starting the history from scratch. It just didn't make sense. If I had even 10-minute head start and some of the history had been taken, it would help me work out what was noise and what was a patient I had to be worried about. So Oscer, the product, was actually like an intermediary step. It was a way to get some initial data about how medical students, but also doctors, ask questions from patients, and then a good sort of moderate technical problem for us to codify all of the different ways that doctors ask questions and patients respond into this like semantic web, so that we could start to understand patients and doctor conversations. In terms of building the product, yeah, like sort of pseudo technical, did a bit of it myself, used some chatbot engines, got as far as I could, and then from the other business, helping people get into med school, had like a decent network of med students that I could test the product with. And early on, it was pretty average. The chat was very brittle. You couldn't ask many medical questions or use really contextual ways of asking. It would just fail. But there was enough validation and enough line of sight into how valuable this problem and product could be for a clinical product. So like where we are today, we've mapped all of adult medicine and can basically take a history for any condition and feel pretty confident that we will gather like the first sort of 70 or 80% of the history pretty accurately. And so that is the value that we've created through Oscer. And whether or not it becomes a massive product is not super important. It's about how we commercialize that in the clinical context. But yeah, so for us, it was always a mission to get sort of the first 10,000 students and then get all of that data and then see how far we get with Oscer, but start working on clinical stuff in the background.
Yeah, nice. And so it's super cool that it sounds like you effectively built an MVP out of like a chatbot, as you said, and it's super scrappy in that way, just to get that kind of product validation there. So Tim, I may have skipped it, but was there an MVP process as well at Eucalyptus? Because we kind of look at it now, and Eucalyptus is this massive company, but how'd you go about testing that idea in the early days?
I think honestly, like the testing process for seed stage companies is probably like slightly overrated. And the reason I think that is true is because like you're in a bit of a 0 or 1 scenario in most cases. Like if you've raised capital and you aren't confident in your delivery and you need to test at some like reasonable scale, then like you actually don't get many shots at it. So if the thing you're trying to do is not going to work, then like you're probably in a position where it's not going to work and you probably should kind of give up on it. I think like where Tom's story is more interesting is like he, I'd imagine, had to validate before he could raise capital, but because we'd come out of a previously reasonably successful startup and a few other previously reasonable successful startups, we raised money like kind of on the idea alone. And so therefore the first version of the product had to be a scalable version of that product. And so the MVP wasn't really an MVP. It was like a first step to a scalable product on a journey that we knew we had to be on. So, and I actually think that's happening more and more, where it's like, because venture firms are investing at the idea stage way more often and at the team stage way more often, like conviction around your initial product is probably more important than the like hacky MVP piece that has historically dominated like the kind of lean startup narrative. And I think like Tom's story is a bit unique because he was coming from like a very unproven background into a new space, and so probably didn't have the venture capital engagement or interest to kind of start that from a funded perspective. But I think actually like our story is like the opposite end of the spectrum, where we had a seed round before we'd kind of even formulated the company.
Yeah, agree. And just to add on, I think like some of that lean startup stuff comes from a time when there wasn't that much competition or products weren't that good. Like you hear about Instagram launching with 9 people and then like TikTok, which would probably be like the next best equivalent social network, is like a 10-year Musical.ly product that took forever and has so many features to get viral adoption. So I think the expectations of users has changed in a big way over time. So it's not that you have to have like a maximalist view, but your idea and what you're building has to be really good and has to be like differentiated enough to get traction. And I kind of agree with Tim, like if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. It's pretty unlikely that you can test and iterate your way all the way to success. If that core idea or differentiation isn't good, you're kind of stuffed from the start, would be my perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, right. It's pretty clear from speaking to both of you that you're smart, successful guys. And so I think the next question that I had is, what are your individual competitive advantages, do you think? Like, are there any skills, practices, or frameworks that you guys have that have enabled you to get to where you are today?
I can jump in on that. I would imagine like Tom's is like, I'm a doctor and therefore it's not that easy. Even though I would like that one much more than the ones that I actually have. But like, I came out of uni with like a very generalist kind of bullshit skill set, did a bit of finance, did a bit of marketing stuff, did a bit of political economy, nothing useful. And I realized like quite quickly that like one thing that is underrated about the journey from like being a generalist out of university to a founder of a company is actually like you lean massively on the specialist skill that you can develop. So like people talk about the value of being a generalist, but like the reality is I got really good at advertising over the course of like 2 years at Koala. I learned a lot about it. I got really good at it. And then like when I was trying to learn stuff in the early days of Eucalyptus, the way that I got a margin of safety on learning those things was by being really good at the one thing I knew how to do really well. So I think like underpriced in the modern be able to do everything environment that we live in is the ability to do one thing better than most people and being able to leverage that into doing other things. And so that's my competitive advantage and probably the only one that I have.
Yeah, I'd say like for me, the main one is like just the technical understanding. So I'd say despite not being an engineer, I'm probably the most technical person in the team. Like if they're really difficult technical problems to solve, I'm usually able to solve them in a pseudo-technical way. So I might not be able to write the lines of code, but I'm usually the one that can solve the problem. And that has been really helpful. And then to Tim's point, having that experience founding a company, like cross-section across everything, I think I can have deep empathy to the most granular level on what every person that works at the company is likely to do. There are areas that are great areas for me, whether it's compliance or other places, but I think for like those core functions like sales, marketing, product, design, all these kinds of things, at some point I was probably doing some shit job of it myself. So it means that when it comes to hiring and inspiring people and understanding what good work product is, I have a really good sense for that. So I think like it's in Tim's experience as well and mine. If you're a generalist coming out or you're a specialist like you are, Sam, like in med, it's really powerful to have an experience in an early stage setting where you have to be a general problem solver. And then either you specialize and develop like a super powerful superpower, like advertising or whatever it is, or you get that deep empathy across different functions in the company. So even if you don't have a superpower, you still would be able to run teams and hire the right people to run those functions well and be able to prosecute their work and know what's good and what's not. Because I think it's hard to do that if you haven't been in an early stage setting.
Yeah, right. And so, sorry, just to like clarify, so you're saying that in the early days of starting your company, it's good to be a generalist and then pivoting either to or like trying to niche down on a specialty.
I think like whatever, at least for me, like whatever you're good at will like it'll attract that type of talent. So like we generally attract like very technically capable people that I think like we otherwise wouldn't if I couldn't speak their language or like solve interesting problems. And then, yeah, it's not like, especially I'm not at the stage Tim's at, but I can see how as the team grows, like we'd be at 60 odd at the moment and like 25 full time, a lot of medical people working part time. Of the 25, like as I get diluted, it's like the kind of shadow of what I was good at becomes the company. It's not me every day in every meeting, like influencing every decision, but the kind of imprint of what I was good at and what the nature of the beast of how the company grew, it starts with whatever you're strong at. And I assume for Tim, it's similar, like that people get attracted to what you're good at and what they want to learn from. And so if they see some like, unique thing about that company that's done particularly well, they'll be attracted to that. And then your company will become rich in that type of talent.
Cool. So I think the next question I had was, you both had pretty interesting careers up until, your current companies. So in hindsight, is there anything that you would have done differently? So for instance, Tom, we were speaking just before the event started about how, last year, at the end of last year, you just, you stopped working full time as a surgical registrar. So yeah, I mean, going back, would you have not studied medicine, or do you think that all those experiences have kind of like led you up until?
Yeah, look, it's hard to say. Like, I'd say there's a part of me that did medicine as like a fail safe. So that part of me was probably always going to exist and always nudge me down that direction. I think I would have tried to have less sunk cost fallacy and maybe move into like entrepreneurship and like really focusing myself in this direction earlier on. But yeah, it just happened the way it happened. And I think I got a good cross section of experience and enough time working in hospitals to have a good sense for how the system works at like all levels that exist. So there's no uncertainty for me in selling into any of those environments, which is probably a benefit. But yeah, I'd say maybe move a bit more quickly, but it's hard when you're 7 years deep.
Yeah, totally. And as someone kind of like grappling with that decision, I can definitely empathize with like the
yeah.
Yeah, Tim, how about yourself? Is there anything in your career up until this point that you would have changed?
I mean, lots of things, but I think like the biggest insight, if like I was like speaking to a university age audience, which it seems like I probably am. I think like the thing that I learned was that like the kind of like status signaling versions of resume stacking are like largely useless. And so like the like low learning environment looks good on the CV. Entities that are like logical employers for graduates are actually like really low learning environments, and like the returns for like taking asymmetric bets. And what I mean by that is like organizations that are high growth where you'll learn a lot in your 20s are like enormous. And Alexei, who was on this call, was a moderately talented Russian accountant at the age of 23, having recently moved to Australia, and he took a graduate-ish job at Canva. And then 2 years later, obviously Canva is a rocket ship, and then takes a financial controller job at Koala, which is a rocket ship, and then turns into the CFO job, and then has been like a co-founder with me at Eucalyptus. And so like, I guess like rejecting, he could easily be a mid-level person at Deloitte right now. And I think like the reality is like the return on a little bit of risk can be enormous. And I think like modern workplaces reward risk at a much, much higher level than they ever have historically. And so I guess like my lesson was I probably should have been more risk on a little bit earlier. And then I guess like the learning that I've taken from that is watching one of my co-founders navigate a very traditional career path in a way that is like slightly non-conventional and have enormous returns from that to the point where he's about to retire.
Yeah, definitely. And to test that a little bit, would you recommend that same advice if someone was, for instance, considering like a top tier, let's say, banking or consulting, so let's say Goldman or McKinsey offer versus like, going into an early stage startup? Is that still the same advice that you would recommend, or does it change a little bit there?
So I think like let's talk about so there are heaps of McKinsey alumni at Eucalyptus, probably like too many if I was being honest. I look at their journey and I look at like the first 2 years out of uni as like a really practical education. I think like they learned a lot. They are a lot better for that experience and they are a lot more rounded for that experience. But I think the ones that spent 3 or 4 years there are no better than the ones that spent 2 years there. So I think like if you view them as elite training institutions and places to learn a lot, then I think like that's really practical. If you view them as places to spend the first 5 years of your career, you're missing the opportunity to be something significantly better.
Yeah, I completely identify with this just generally in life. Like I think all learning is like a log curve and like the rate can be different, but then over time, like inevitably, unless you're making some gigantic shift in the organization you're in, which is pretty rare, the level of learning just tails out. And you manage the people that were in your role, and then you manage the managers that managed you. So like, it's just you're heading towards a constraint and you will never break through that constraint. If that constraint is like your skill and talent and value outside of that organization, like it just slowly like reaches the end of that. So I think it's called the Pareto principle. It's like 80% of the results are 20% of the time. Like I think you don't want to jump from org to org, but if you're feeling your learning lag, like I would move on. I completely agree. Like I wouldn't be able to be doing what I'm doing if I didn't like agree to run marketing at Frasers, for example. Was I qualified? No, not really, but I kind of worked it out.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's like super helpful, especially considering a lot of our audience are probably in university or just recently graduated. So yeah, prioritizing that learning and kind of like that steep kind of inflection is I think is important. So moving on, are there any like books, podcasts, Twitter follows, communities that have helped you along your journey that you would recommend to people in the audience, bearing in mind that a lot of them are aspiring founders or maybe even current founders?
Yeah, I probably should prepare for this one. I don't know, maybe we can take turns. I like the All In podcast.
I do not like the All In podcast. So we can agree with that. So it depends what you're trying to do, right? Like I read a lot of health tech stuff. And this is probably a tip for Tom as well, but like I'm part of this community called Health Tech Nerds, which is exactly what it sounds like. A whole lot of health tech product and engineering people, also founders talking about trends, mostly US trends, but like valuable. I think for like business model thinking, I lean on like Stratechery mostly. I also read, what else do I read? I read like 2PM for commerce stuff. I read Lean Lux for commerce stuff. I read this thing called Exits and Outcomes for health tech stuff. I read, I could compile a list of 50 different things that I read all the time. I would read all of the startup content basically, which is probably too much, but I definitely have learned a lot. I listen to Invest Like the Best all the time. I think that's the best kind of business model thinking podcast. I listen to Business Breakdowns. I listen to The Portal, another podcast, kind of more general. There's a lot.
Yeah, like Acquired, Exponential. There's lots of books like Atomic Networks, classic ones like, what is it? The Ben Horowitz books. I can never get the title right. Hard Thing About Hard Things. Trying to go through the list in my mind. Yeah.
Tom, I'm also a fan of the All In podcast, not only for the startup talk, but also the talk of expenses. Yeah, beautiful. So I think the other thing that I'm kind of curious about is, both Eucalyptus and Oscar are known for, their incredible talent. So how do you guys go about building a strong team? Are there any heuristics that you have in place when it comes to hiring that allows you to determine who you want on your team and who you don't want on your team?
Yeah, so we've got 250 people now. I think that, okay. So how do I feel about hiring? What I think about hiring is, like, at the early stages, the most important thing is network-based hiring and being able to produce a compelling story that you're telling to people in your broad network about why they should join you. And that is like a very one-to-one experience. And like, it comes down to your ability to think in a structured way, communicate in a structured way, and like sell a compelling vision. If you can raise venture capital, you can hire your first 10 employees. They're kind of like linked. Beyond that, I think a company culture starts to form. I've said this before, but I think like what is meaningful between 10 and 50 is the promises that you make to your first 10. If you keep them, they will become evangelists for the company. Them as evangelists for the company will create the next 30 or 40 employees. Beyond that, beyond 50, you're probably looking at starting to think about like systems that actually allocate and find and like screen talent. And that's a bit different. So it comes down to your interview processes. It comes down to your values. It comes down to scalable versions of your first 50. And I think like that's where we not necessarily have been as good, and probably have leaned too heavily into the first 50 to then create the next 100. And then beyond that, I think you start to think about like an employer brand. And then I think like the question is like, what is different that you offer that others don't? And I think like the classic example is like, why would you come work at Eucalyptus when Canva is 500 meters away and Immutable is 1 kilometer away? And most of them, they're likely to both pay you more than you'll get working for us. And I think it's like, well, what type of work you get to do? How much autonomy do you get to do? Who's the people you get to work with? And if you can win on those three, then salary will come forth. And that will be the way that you kind of win in a competitive environment. And if you're winning in a competitive environment, you get your choice of the best talent, and that's what will win you the game at the end of the day.
Yeah, I can maybe go from a different perspective, like for the audience who's thinking about starting their first startups and trying to find the first people to work for them. Completely agree with the compelling story. And like there was probably 4 or 5 people that started at Oscar who made promises that eventually we would raise venture capital, and like one day I'd be able to pay them more than, what, at least almost what they're worth, because I wasn't even close to paying them that. I agree, like once you execute on those promises, then those people are, evangelists, and will grow out their own teams and will network and find people that you wouldn't have otherwise had access to. In terms of like a heuristic, I would say what I've learned from both phrases, like hiring up to sort of 200 and then at Oscar so far, is it's hard to, there's like an instinctual read about a person's personality, and I'm still working out, like you have to have good structure and projects and all these kinds of things, but I find that those instinctual reads will play out in either a really good way or a really bad way, and it's very hard to tell upfront how those people are going to play out. So for instance, like if you get the sense that someone's maybe a bit controlling about the way they work, then it inevitably they will be in a significant way, because they're showing you a good face in the interview. And hopefully that means that they bring great structure, but sometimes they might be limiting processes and going too slow. And so I think one thing we've done particularly well is being kind and empathetic, but moving on quickly. So if people aren't a good fit for the team and there's only a certain number of people that you can afford to have in those early stages, I think it's okay to have an honest conversation and move on, and only keep like the absolute purest concentration of the best people for the role in your team. Like I often see people say, "Oh, we retain everyone," like no one's ever been fired. And for me, that's like a red flag, because inevitably, no matter how good you are at hiring, like maybe 1 in 10 are not going to be perfect for their role. And so if you're retaining people that aren't awesome, then the group of people at your company won't be awesome. So that's what we've done well. We do it kindly. I think Justin Khan has a couple of good ideas about this. Like, you should give them enough time of leave and money to make you feel not sleep fine at night after the day of firing. So I think if you do all that right, people will leave in the right way and think of your company just as highly, because you have a really high standard of talent and a high performance culture.
This may be a little bit of a silly question, but in the early days of a startup, how much of your hiring is on the basis of need versus just coming into contact with people that you're saying, this is an amazing person, they're a weapon, they have an amazing skill set, and I just want them on the team. Even if like you didn't really go into that meeting or interaction with them. Is there much of that happening or not? Is it mostly needs driven?
I'd say probably for us, it's been maybe 70% needs, 30% awesome people. I think over time it becomes more utilitarian, but early on, when it's like that like core nucleus, you might pick people who are slightly like, yeah, can kind of do anything. Like you want the kind of generalists. You don't necessarily want the people that are super specialized. You want people that can change titles every 6 months as required to be what you need them to be. So those generalist smart types, consulting, general business backgrounds or previous founders or some combination thereof are really useful. But yeah, I can see it becomes more utilitarian over time. You still want that process to hire the amazing people, but you just need to have a framework to put them into.
And so both of you are in the process of scaling and internationalizing. Eucalyptus is probably a little bit further down that path than Oscar. So just curious, like what is the global strategy there? And is that something that you thought of pretty early on in the course of the business? Or is it something that only came to mind a little bit later?
Our business is about being able to build something of significant, like let's call it like venture. I think one of the like missed points about venture capital backed companies is kind of like once you get on the roller coaster of venture capital, you kind of have to have a path to being a, let's call it like a $250 million revenue business or bigger for that path to be worthwhile. And so we knew going in that we either had to build like a $250 million plus revenue business in Australia, or we had to find a path to global markets. And our view that in healthcare was that in healthcare, it's very rare to be global from day one, unless you're kind of in drug discovery or some other like kind of like universal system. But the reality is most systems are local. And so we needed to be dominant locally before we could start to think about global scale. And so not that we're there yet, but we certainly feel like we're like kind of on the precipice of that position in Australia. And therefore we can start to think about scaling a bit more globally now.
Yeah, I'd say for us, like, so like it's still under wraps officially, but we're working on our clinical product Heidi, and Heidi is a way for GPs to offer like a virtual clinic from their in-person practice and offer some of the sexy tools that you and others pioneered from their own everyday practice in a more generalized way, less kind of persona-driven services. And we bake in all of our medical knowledge graph and other things to speed them up and make it economically feasible through Heidi. So for us, it just mainly meant that from like an architecture perspective, we considered it early on because there are security, encryption and other implications. Like there's ISO standards, which are common in Australia, but obviously GDPR in Europe and HIPAA and other like SOC 2 and things in the US. So just from a strict technical perspective, you have to make a decision. Like, are you going to re-engineer everything, or are you going to accept sort of like maybe going slightly slower, but account for all of the possible future architectures up front? We opted for somewhere in between, like a middle compliance mode where we can launch in the US more quickly than we otherwise could have, but still ultimately like be built for Australia to start off with. And then the other thing is in terms of like how we deal with medicine lists and condition lists and all these kinds of things, just building in a microservice architecture from day one. So for the non-technical, microservices just means that each part of your software is broken up into small parts, and each of those parts serve a specific function. So the condition list would have its own specific microservice. So if we do launch in the US, we can swap, like hot swap in Australian and US and UK drug lists and active ingredients and third-party providers for each of those different services. Whereas if you built like a monolithic product, which is just like one gigantic code base, nothing separated, it's kind of hard to unwind those things. But again, there's pros and cons. So it depends, to Tim's point, it depends on what your funding trajectory is, what type of product you're building. For us, it's general with specific localization endpoints. So like we want to get to a position where we're launched and have good validation metrics on our unit economics in Australia. And then we have proof of appetite for a similar product in the US, but probably be raising money to actually like do the work to make it a US product and like change out all those microservices to make it work well in that context. But yeah, that's the main consideration. I think just like architecture, product, business model, all these kinds of things in health generally don't translate particularly well. The US is notoriously complicated and busy, and it's quite hard. So generally, yeah, find a model that works in Australia. If you're in venture, you'll consider other countries, of course, as part of the game. But yeah, I still think you got to validate something on a small scale first before you kind of screw yourself over with too much complexity.
And if there's one thing I know about founders is that, you know, they're constantly ideating, constantly noodling away on different potential ideas. So if you guys weren't working on, you know, Oscar and Eucalyptus, what other problem would you be tackling? I mean, who knows? Do you guys have a side hustle that you use to distract yourself from your main hustle?
I don't know. I don't know if we have a similar answer, Tim, but I think like product analytics, marketing attribution, there are heaps of products, but there's no like panacea, like the ClickUp equivalent, like the one tracking website, product, services, analytics product to rule them all. I just find it's just like it's always a million times more complicated than it should be, and seems very like manual. And it would be amazing if you could just say, yeah, like I'll use a Shopify website or the equivalent website service, and it bakes in like all my attribution, and I can build product and add like certain hooks into the base code, and it's just all tracked from day dot, rather than needing a team of like CRO engineers and like a million people to do something that should just work. But yeah, maybe future idea, hopefully 10, 20 years away. Hopefully be solved by the time we get around to doing it.
I've got like Eucalyptus is an interesting business because it's like a platform by which we can launch whatever we feel like. So I have a really interesting non-compete deal with Blackbird, which says Tim and Alexi have founded a business that starts businesses. And therefore, if they start a business that is a business, that will count as competition. And so I'm very locked into my non-compete. And so I'm either a very uncreative person and have no other ideas. And even if I did, they would be regulated out of existence by my non-compete. So maybe I'm just limiting it.
Yeah, no worries. Tim, feel free to email me your ideas and maybe I can do it on your behalf.
I actually think Tom's idea is a good one, which is like, there are reasons why the product he's talking about does not exist. But also I think like attribution and tracking at scale are big problems.
Definitely. So last question before we go to some of the audience questions. Also, just a reminder to the audience, click the Slido link if you've got anything you want to ask Tim and Tom. So last question, what advice do you have for any aspiring founders that may be in the audience? Feel free to be cliche. Oftentimes it's cliche for a reason. But yeah, is there any parting?
I can go first. Yeah. My advice is think about business model more than you would imagine. So like I see a lot of ideas that are interesting ideas and probably have a product market solution to solve and like really clever, but like the best businesses are the ones that understand their business model from a very early point. And like the example that I'll give you is like Eucalyptus as a business model, pretty bad. Like it's largely a commerce business. It's like reasonably high margin without being amazingly high margin. And so it requires a level of execution that is like ridiculously high. We need to like make sure that we win at almost everything that we do. And there isn't great retention, and like it's a poorly thought through business model in a lot of ways that relies on a lot of like strong execution to make it work. Whereas compare this to another business, which is like, let's take Dovetail, for example, another business in the Blackbird portfolio. It's an incredible business because it's a bottom-up B2B SaaS business. And it relies on like a very low cost distribution model, which is like people sign up for individual seats and then it spreads through businesses in a really interesting way. And so like it has a negative churn profile, and it's just like a machine of a business that makes execution so much easier. And so like one thing I would have told myself before I started is like, think about what your business, your unit economics look like at scale, and kind of think through that process before you even start, because it's such a superpower if you get it right early.
Yeah, completely agree. But like, you don't want to die as a founder with a product that's awesome, but no one that's willing to pay for it. I just think it's like the most painful thing ever. So definitely don't do that. I've had like small experiences at Frasers where we built things that just like never, they were good ideas, but just never had legs for people to buy them. In maybe like a slightly different dimension, I think I do think you need to be solving a problem that you can experience for yourself, or have unique insight in the market, like some asymmetry that you see that no one else sees, maybe in the Euc example. So I guess I worry that like if you're a founder too early and you haven't had those experiences, like how much of a real like raw guttural problem do you have that you're solving, and how much of an like asymmetrical unique insight can you have early on? Now, it's not impossible, right? There are founders who are 15, 16 who build amazing big businesses, but just like really prosecute and find people who aren't going to be yes people to give you like strong feedback on your business and your ideas. But if you get through those stages and you feel like you have something, then I'd really encourage you to try to get as far as you can with product. I think that's what won Nick and the guys at Blackbird over from my perspective. Like, there was a big unknown for them, was like, okay, you're a doctor, cool, but can you actually make anything? Like, what's the proof that you can actually make a product given a good idea? And having like Oscer exist and have users and look pretty and function was really key. And I think now more than ever, you can do that with so many no code, low code solutions. So you don't need to be a software engineer, but if you can take that conceptual idea and make it into a product in some 70 to 80% form, it'll help you get that pre-seed money and start the ball rolling.
Yeah, beautiful. Okay, so we might hand it off to the audience to ask some questions, and I think Sharon's going to be running this Q&A portion, so I will handball it off to her.
Yeah, wonderful. So we'll just walk through Q&A. I think Emily has a question. Do you want to unmute and ask that one?
Yeah, sure. Just want to say thanks so much for taking time out of your day to speak to us, Tim and Tom. But yeah, I guess my question is around, so healthcare as an industry is really heavily regulated and it's known to be quite slow moving. I was curious about how that's impacted and challenged your company in terms of like business model, product offerings, adoption, all those kinds of things.
Yeah, so I think like in this world, there's like like the light side and the dark side. And I think D2C is the dark side. It's not bad, but it's just the easier path, right? So like you build a really compelling service and you go direct to patients. And I like when we think through our business model with Heidi, like there's always that like draw to the dark side. Like, should we just like, oh God, it's hard to sell to clinics. We'll just go straight to patients. No. There's reasons we shouldn't do that. It's, there's no way we can make advertising as nice as you can others, or like we should go direct to doctors and just like avoid the clinics entirely. So I think whenever you found anything in health, it'll be very, very painful. There'll be problems that you wouldn't face in a B2B SaaS product or in any other enterprise facing product. I think they're mostly solvable. Like I think you definitely will need like compliance help, but I don't think sometimes like there's like an adage of like healthcare is really regulated and you can't do anything. I don't think that's the case, but back to Tim's earlier point, I think you have to build a business model that is so compelling and so worthwhile that you actually incentivize the people to change their behavior. So for us, that means creating a way of practicing on Heidi that is so much better than the existing practice management systems that GPs will like audibly sigh as they go back to their existing practice management software and never want to use it. So that when we draw them into our ecosystem, they will stay and they'll want to use us, and they'll get to the point of ditching their clinic because they just want to work for Heidi because of how much better that experience is. So yeah, there are ways, but you definitely have to be, I think, quite enterprising in the business model and the products that you build to not get caught in regulation. Like if you're going straight for a medical device or drug discovery or something in that direction where it is like super regulated, it's really, really tough. You can win, but yeah, it's pretty hard to do it without industry experience or people on founding or board who have that experience to get you through all those hurdles.
We have been like we represent in Tom's analogy the dark side, and so we have to manage this idea of like doing the right thing by the patient, and then we have to hold ourselves to a burden that is like very high but it's also self-regulated in that sense, because like we are managing the relationship with the patient ourselves and using doctors as contractors in that environment. And so therefore, you need to maintain your own regulatory bar in a way that like a product that sells to doctors will never do, because they're their customers. And so therefore that bar will be maintained by the doctors. And we have a slightly different model where we directly interact with the patients and have doctors as contractors. So I think like there is this, like, how do you set up an infrastructure within your own business, which is like a really safeguard on that? And we have like a clinical director, a medical director, a number of doctors on staff, heaps of nurses, lots of clinical infrastructure to protect the patients. And then also, I think like there's also like a healthy level of like, I guess like demand for innovation on where regulation seems dated. And I think like in the doctor world, that's a bit rarer, but in the pharmacy world, that's everywhere. And so like challenging regulation that is essentially protectionist for the pharmacist world is worthwhile. And I think like you really have to have like a compass within your own entity, which is like, do we feel like the regulation here is doing the right thing by the patient, or is it there to protect an industry? And if it's there to protect an industry, how can we go about building the case for change over time? And I think like in telehealth, that's been a lot of what we had to do. And in telepharmacy, that's a lot of what we had to do as well. So you have to have a healthy appetite for change if you want to really change systems.
Agree.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. So we have a question for Tom. Is there a particular stage of a medical degree where it is ideal for founding a startup? For example, should you complete a number of years at uni or specialize?
Yeah, so there's probably two schools of thought. So there's the specialize, become a specialist, and then build something for that specialty area that you have a really deep interest and now expertise in. I think that's a terrible idea. One of the reasons I left medicine is that the training bottleneck in Australia is next level. So most of my friends, went to the fancy pants Melbourne University, got high marks, and they're still stuck waiting to get on the training program to become surgeons, which takes like a 6-7 year process for most people. I think I know one person out of 330 students at the best med school in Australia. So I think that is definitely a bad idea for the medicos out there. I would suggest getting experiences early on. It's pretty much no risk to take a year off after internship at any point. You could take a year straight after internship. You could take a year in between residence years. And also during med school is when you have the absolute most time. So I think in like the first year, it's, lots of content, but then in the later years, when you're clinical, if you play your cards right and go to a hospital where they don't like baby you and force you to be in certain places at certain times. For people that go to Melbourne, that would be St. Vincent's. Like, don't go to St. Vincent's, go anywhere else. They will let you kind of be flexible. So you'll be able to do what you want to do as long as you satisfy your clinical requirements. So that's what I did. So I'd spend maybe 30 hours at the hospital and then spend like my other 30 or 40 hours a week at Fraser's, like doing all the other stuff that I was doing. So I would try to get that experience in a business setting as early as you can, like do internships, be an analyst for someone, be a medical knowledge team writer for us. You'll get a sense for what the working style and what like the problem space is in health tech. And then most people will get either really drawn to it or they'll be happy in their clinical career. So yeah, try to get those early experiences. Then if you like it, don't do medicine, do health tech.
Yeah, super interesting. The next question is for Tim. So Eucalyptus's vision sounds like it has changed a lot over the years. What is the desired end goal? And it sort of ties into the next question, which is how would you sort of define success for yourself as well as a founder?
Yeah, I think like what we've done is we've like in the reality is like we've stepped up in ambition. So I think like the early versions of our company were designed to build to a nice exit. And I think like that is something that we've kind of achieved, and we would, even if we stop now, we would do well. So I think like, but then you get to this point where you've got the space and the capital to think of something like a lot more ambitious. And I think therefore we've taken that time to think about that and go, well, like actually like the combination of our position and COVID has meant that like we've got the rare opportunity to imagine a like digital first healthcare system. And I think like that opportunity you only get once in your life. And I think we want to take that, and whether we're capable of executing on that, I don't know. But I think like the end point for this business is if there is a central point through which your healthcare is managed, and that's not going to come from the system out. Like I think, I mean, I'd imagine Tom would vote with me that it's very unlikely that like there is a mass adoption, patient-centric health record that combines all of the different practitioners you need to interact with and like allows a really high quality of care. And so we feel like we're uniquely positioned to have that opportunity in Australia. And if we can execute on that on the next couple of years, that will be great. And like my measurement of success based on that is, can we like meet out? I think like the reality is like your primary ambition is to like do right by your team and by your investors. And then I think secondary to that is like your customers and the system that you serve. And so I think like if we can be meaningfully helpful in how people particularly treat lifestyle conditions, I think that I'll consider that a huge success. And if I can stop at that point in a couple of years, I'll be really happy.
Nice. Yeah, I agree. You just have to look at my health record to get a sense for what a government driven central initiative looks like. It's just like random PDFs. Like I was in trauma bays last year, and someone would have a terrible accident and all they'd have is their wallet, and then my health record was like literally more useless than just like me just seeing the patient. Like, there's just no value add. So yeah, definitely needs to be built.
Yeah, I think we have time for maybe one more question, and that is from Nikhil. Do you want to unmute and ask, or?
I'm in hospital right now, so
yeah. So the question is, why not start in the US? How is the transition there from Australia? Due to they're very different markets and the systems.
Mm-hmm.
And do you have a plan in terms of how you're likely to raise there to get access to those distribution channels?
Yeah, I can talk to the US. So yeah, so for us, it's our natural second market. I think there's so many unknowns in the US. So like Nikhil, I don't know how far along you guys are, but like it's at least 2 orders of magnitude more complicated in terms of layers of different organizations and people and sets of incentives in the way that the system pays for services and patients get their services. So like as an example, unless again, you go to the dark side and go outside of the system. So if you're going D2C with software and like hardware, completely understand, like, you're building a home monitoring service and like something very elegant, then yeah, that's easy. Like you have to go through all the regulatory hoops, but it's a big market. You go direct to the US. If you're trying to build a product where doctors are actually going to practice and you're going to work like kind of within the system, which is what we're trying to do, using like Medicare rebates and like operating within a clinic environment without disrupting the whole lot, then it's just easier. It's a smaller leap of faith to do that in your hometown where you know exactly how the system works. If you've got medical people in your team, they would have been in GP settings. They know exactly what softwares they use. The set of incentives that exists in a really intimate way. If you have US doctors in your founding team, then maybe you could make the argument that's easier. But all you have to do is look at the set of startups that exist, and like it's niche on niche on niche on niche for a reason. So it's like the primary care, digital first primary care service for chronic kidney disease in Alabama, because it's so complicated, state by state, different set of rules. You have to convince a payer in that area to agree to pay for your service, so like an insurer, if you want to access a significant group of patients. So yeah, it's just tough out there in the US. It's a big market, but actually when you get down to it, it's probably not as big as doing something in Australia really well. Also, I hope you're okay in hospital and getting better.
Yeah, wonderful. That sort of wraps up our Q&A session. Sam, do you want to sort of wrap it up?
Yeah, easy. So that's a wrap on the Health Tech event. Thank you so much to our speakers, Tom and Tim, for sharing their valuable time. So before everyone leaves, both Eucalyptus and Oscer are hiring, so be sure to check out their career pages. If you're interested in what we do at Textbook Ventures, be sure to check us out on LinkedIn and subscribe to our newsletter. So hopefully the links are in the chat. We've got some exciting events coming up this year, including a pitch competition. where we'll be giving the winners of that pitch competition some pre-seed funding, some seed funding, as well as some VC mentorship. So stay tuned for that and other events. Otherwise, I'll let everyone get to their Thursday night. Tom and Tim, again, thank you so much. And
thank you guys. Have a good long weekend.
Yes.
See you all.
Thank you.